Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. It's time for another reading wrap up. I'm going to share with you 4 of the books that I read in the past month. So without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? So as you probably know, last month was Victober, and just before I carry on, I want to give a special shout out to Kate Howe, whose channel I will put in the description below, because Kate is one of the people who hosts Victober every year, and her channel is incredible. Her output of videos is prolific. I don't know how she quite does it. So if you can't get enough of bookish enthusiasm, then I really suggest you go and check out Kate's channel. So with Victober, obviously a lot of what I read and what I'll be focusing on in this video are English classics, because of course that's where Victoria reigned over. And I'm going to go through 4 pretty brilliant books, 2 of which are very renowned. I would say 3 are very renowned, to be quite honest. So let's have a look, shall we? The first book that I'm going to cover is probably one of the most famous books in all of English literature, and it is none other than Jane Eyre. Do you like this cover, by the way? It's the Barnes & Noble, is it? No, it's not. Yes, it is. It's Barnes & Noble's signature edition hardback. You can't really get these except on eBay now. Quite small print inside, and surprisingly, the cutting of the paper is very rough, but nonetheless a lovely cover, and I do like a good hardback. So Jane Eyre, I mean, there's not much I can say about it that hasn't already been said. One of the great heroines of literature. What's so wonderful about Jane Eyre when you read her character itself is that she's not perfect. She definitely has a strong sense of justice, a strong sense of goodness, but when she's wronged, she has a very fiery nature. Jane Eyre, the character, she's very romantic and independent and drawn to nature. You see, when she gets her position as a governess in Thornfield Hall, where the great Mr. Rochester lives, there's so much given to the way she describes the countryside around about, and the trees that are there, and the walks through the gardens with the lilacs. There's a great amount given to the vast bleakness of the countryside around the boarding school that she's at. And she's always drawn to what is over the hill, which is a lovely demonstration of the adventurous spirit. Now, as much as I could go into a great deal about the book in various ways, what I want to point out about this is the fascination I have with how Charlotte Bronte basically subverts the Gothic genre. It's a really clever book. You don't spot it straight away, and I must say the second half of the book, the writing becomes so passionate, sort of more like her sister Emily than the first part. But the way she goes about the Gothic genre, because it's called a Gothic novel, but I would say you would class this as New Gothic, because there is an element of realism drawn into it with the boarding school and the hardships of young children and domestic abuse of young children. But it's got all the Gothic characteristics. Now, if you want to know the Gothic aspects, I will leave below a video on the 7 aspects of Gothic literature, which I'm sure you will find fascinating. If you haven't already watched it, I really recommend you go and see that. In this, you have the classic double. So you've got her time in Thornfield Hall with Rochester, and then you see her away in a country school later on, dwelling with a gentleman and his 2 sisters. You see Rochester, who is impassioned, who doesn't suffer fools gladly. He talks what he thinks. He shoots from the hip, is the expression we would use now. And he's quite gruff and brusque and to the point with Jane, and asks her things like, "Do you think I am handsome?" Which, that's not really etiquette. And then when you go to the next character later on in the book, the churchman, the missionary, he wants to be a missionary, he has got all the piety that you would expect of a good person. And there's this contrast between him and Rochester, but it's not good versus bad or noble versus ignoble, because Rochester has his redeeming qualities in that he's understanding of people. He may be hard-edged and hard-nosed and a bit prickly, but he tolerates people. He appreciates sincerity. Whereas the next gentleman, whose name is completely slipping me at this point, so put a comment down below, he is pious, but his attractions are very self-oriented. He's so given to the gospel that he's become hard with it. There's no balance with him. So it's this contrast, the doubles. So you've got the doubles in characters, you've got the doubles in the environment in which they live. On top of that, you've also got sinister goings on. You have things like a fire that breaks out unexpectedly at night. You have cackling. You also have the mysterious character Grace Poole, who Jane Eyre comes across a fair bit in Thornfield Hall, and she's nonplussed by her. She's wary of her. You find the sense of menace and trouble in the background, like the Gothic, with the great imposing house, which you always have, and the sweep of nature in the raw. But Charlotte Bronte subverts it. There's an incident with a fortune teller, an old hag, which puts the frighteners on a couple of people. And that's deliberately part of the Gothic genre, yet Bronte makes it humorous. So suddenly it gives us a sinister environment, but then knocks it back down again. You've got the contradistinction between the maid and Grace Poole and Adele, who is the child that Jane Eyre is teaching. And then later in the next house, you've got the Rivers sisters. There's the name. It's St. John, or that's the quick way of saying St. John Rivers. That's the guy who's the missionary. There's this constant opposing of characters, but not as stark, for instance, as in Wuthering Heights, where you've got a definitely good family and mild family, and then the havoc-wreaking Heathcliff and his lot on that side in Wuthering Heights. It's just ever so clever how Bronte goes beneath and cuts underneath the Gothic genre. So you feel the sense of foreboding, but you can't quite place your finger on it and say it is Gothic. And it's a masterpiece of writing. Whether Bronte did this deliberately or whether it just come to her naturally, I don't know. But the effect is astounding. And some of the descriptions, some of the way that Jane Eyre expresses her inward emotions to us, the reader, is phenomenal writing. Overall, I would say that what Jane Eyre is about, partially is about redemption, because again, as with Gothic, there's a hidden, mysterious backstory that you come to learn as the book opens up that affects it. And this ever-present pushing of two different ideals which belong in the heart of Jane Eyre is a good exploration of how no character living is a one-dimensional emotion. We change as we move through our actions. If you haven't read it, then I highly recommend you read it. If you've read it but haven't read it for a long time, this is a book that grows with you. It will give you something new when you come to it with a few years between, as your own life experience has grown. And there's also, just a last word on the Gothic genre, there is also the significance of foreshadowing through storms and clouds and lightning strikes. So, and there's elements which remind me of Catherine Cookson. You know, you have fires in Catherine Cookson. It seems to me there's always someone who commits suicide in Catherine Cookson, and a house burns down and someone gets into debt through gambling. It all creates drama. Obviously, in Jane Eyre, it's done much, much better. But there is that atmosphere of trouble and torment in the background. So, that was the first one, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. The next book that I'm going to share with you in this wrap-up is a deliberate pick. I wanted to read this book straight after Jane Eyre because the two authoresses knew each other very well, and that is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. You've probably read it, absolutely cracking piece of work, very, very famous. This book is so thought-provoking because, like a lot of classics, it explores an idea or a habit that is observed in society. And this book primarily focuses on the topic of doubt, but you could embellish that or round that out a bit more with doubt, reasonableness and change. The protagonist is Margaret Hale, the daughter of a curate, a vicar, and his wife, who live in the small, idyllic little country village or hamlet of Helston, where they've got this beautiful, small, albeit small, little house which has got honeysuckle growing on it. And what happens is the vicar, so Margaret's father, who is a great, great character, so placid and mild, he begins to have doubts about whether he should belong to the Church of England. And you think at that time that's quite scandalous to have doubts. He doesn't doubt God, but he doubts the church's authority to make up their own rules beyond the scriptures. And so, in keeping with his conscience, he cannot serve for the Church of England and decides to remove his family from lovely Helston, and he has to go up to a northern industrial cotton manufacturing town called Milton, where he wants to teach people the classics, so Latin and Greek and so forth. So they go to Milton, and what you see from the off is the prejudice of Margaret, her mother, Margaret's aunt, whom she used to live with, and their attitude towards the Northerners, that they're an uncouth lot, that the towns are all dirty, that all they're interested in is money, they're avaricious, it's all progress, 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 no appreciation for soul, for gentility, for religion. Because when you get into Milton, you've got obviously poor people who are working at the mills, and Margaret comes across a particular family, and she gets very attached to one of the daughters who is going to, it seems, die, or at least get very ill, because she's worked in the cotton factories and inhaled all this cotton over time, and it's clogging her lungs. But she's a lovely young girl, and that girl has no doubts. She's very, very religious, whereas her father, on the other side, he is a little more sceptical of there even being a God. And then Margaret meets the mill owner, Mr. Thornton, who has made his way to the top of industry, and he's a very hard-nosed character. He knows how to make a profit, and he doesn't tolerate the ideas of the what are they called, the workers in the mill who want to go on strike. And Margaret talks to him, but she's already prejudiced towards anyone who thinks in terms of money and manufacturing. She thinks it's morally wrong, it's uncouth. But he has a prejudice towards Southerners. He thinks they're too simple-minded, that they're too lazy, that they're too all about refinement and etiquette and not really real in the world. And yet there's an attraction between the two. Now, what happens when you find someone who holds the absolute opposite ideals to yourself, but at the same time, you can't help but be drawn to the force of their nature? Because Margaret, she can hold herself aloof. She can turn away from people. She can use her refinement to her advantage. And Thornton, his arguments are brusque, to the point, forceful, and Margaret can't always answer his arguments. Now, I won't give anything away, but you see these two characters circling one another in the book, and you begin to see how each one cannot convincingly stay with their own ideals, that they're forced by each other's arguments and each other's presence and character to confront the idea that they might need to alter their perception a little bit. Now, there's a whole other bunch of people who feature in this book, but what you will notice is that everyone, as they go through life, has certain doubts. And I think what Gaskell was particularly interested in was religious doubt, because of, in this time period, we're talking the 1850s. So you've got the evangelical movement started like the beginning of that century. And you can see that people are doubting the auspices of the church of the day, particularly the Church of England, but even the Catholic Church, because a lot of the vicars and priests and whatnot of the time, they would espouse some ideas, but they seemed to live in comfort when the poor were living in, abject poverty. Well, it goes without saying, that's why they're poor. So there was a lot of doubt in society, and also progress through industry. Do we need God? Can humans find their own way? Doubt riddled society at the time. And it was a time of massive upheaval, because we often think of technology and industry as the most significant things pushing us forward as a civilization. That's absolutely wrong. It contributes, but philosophy is what shapes society. Those ideals, ideas, premises that we assume from the off, which cannot be proven, which underpin our modes of thinking, our modes of conduct, our morality. You can't escape this. And at this point, because of the technological burst on the scene in industrial England, it was changing ideas that governed life. And there was a very clear north-south divide in the country, hence the title North and South. Don't get me wrong, this is not a complex book, but it's beautifully done, where Gaskell is seeing the change in society, and she's beginning to explore how people are confronting this change as they move into the cities, and how the more higher levels of society are being altered by the up and coming nouveau riche, the manufacturers in the north. So it's absolutely brilliant. But there's also the clash of industry leaders versus the worker. So we're talking about the power of labour. Karl Marx would talk about this later, and that would have a huge effect on civilization as we know it today. All of the rumblings and groanings were going on, and what we get here is a fictionalized account. And it sort of actually opens your mind to a little glimmer of what it must have been like at that time. An exceptionally good book. I highly recommend you read this. So reading it alongside Jane Eyre, different writing styles, but I can see why both authoresses appreciated each other and their styles of writing. They were very honest and very thoughtful, and they critiqued their own characters' internal monologues. And I find that particularly interesting. So, have you read it? What did you think of it? The next book I read as part of Victober was Kim by Rudyard Kipling, and the reason I picked this is not only is it a great book, but I wanted something from one of the British colonies under the Empress Victoria, India of course being the jewel in the British crown as it was called. Kim himself is a young whippersnapper of a kid, a street urchin, who is actually British. His father, I believe, was Irish, and his second name was Kimball. But his father and his mother died while he was little, and he was raised by some other people, and they called him Kim, so short for Kimball, his father's surname. He loves the Indian life. He loves all the different religions, the different types of characters, the different castes. This boy is marvellous, and what you get through Kim's eyes is undoubtedly Rudyard Kipling's absolute love of India and its people. The message in this is not overtly anti-colonial, but it's definitely anti-colonial. Kim, you see, meets a chap at the beginning, a lama being a monk. He's come from Tibet, from over the mountains. Now, Kim knows all the different religions. He talks about the Sikhs, and he talks about the Hindus, and he talks about the Muslims, and he talks about the Sindhi. So he knows everybody. But he's not seen a lama before. And so he's intrigued by this guy. He meets this lama, and the lama tries to beg, but he's rubbish at it. And you see how Kim is such a brilliantly adapted little ruffian that everyone that meets him calls him an imp. And he goes and gets food for the lama, and he just becomes attached to the lama's way of thinking and his spirituality. And he decides he wants adventure, so he's going to help this Lama try and find this river, which the Lama believes is in India, that will give him sort of perfect healing, perfect peace to become part of Nirvana. And off they go through the Indian country under British rule. Kim himself has had a prophecy about himself, but it's sort of a garbled one which has been made up. However, certain events happen which Kim interprets as being a fulfillment of his prophecy. And you see Kim grow from a child into his late teens. And he gets sucked into something called the Great Game. And that is, because he is actually British, he gets adopted by the British intelligence services to work as a spy. And it's how he works with the Lama, his devotion to the Lama, but his need to progress as well, and his tours through India. What's so beautiful about this book is the people that he deals with, the way he gets on the packed train and deals with different characters. You know, the way he uses epithets and swear words. When he talks about someone being, he says, your mother was born under a bazaar basket. You know, he's fearless, this boy. And how he's coached by the Lama, but how the Lama learns from him as well, this young lad. And his wakening up to literacy and topography, sort of measuring the land. We see the influence of outside nations on India, sort of fighting over it, and the people themselves within it. And the British do not come off, nor do the Russians or the French come off very well at all in this. They seem to be the most humdrum of societies. They are technologically advanced, they can impose their will. But the spirituality, like when you see the character who he lies in the grass and feels his health returning. What you've got is just this spiritual essence, that there is more to humanity than just accomplishing things like the railroad, which is a symbol of industry and progress. And it's just beautiful. It is so colourful, so vivid. Some of the scenes of the marketplaces will just blow your mind. They're so alive and chaotic. It's just a brilliant read. And it gives you an insight into what India was like in the reign of the British Empire. So I highly recommend it. If I could relate it to someone, Kim is very much, he's sort of halfway between Don Quixote and Huckleberry Finn. You know, it's that sort of endless quest, but he doesn't quite know what his quest is. But you see him growing and exploring life. And that's the thing Kim loves. It's life. He loves the buildings. He loves the people. He loves the bustle. He loves the danger. One thing he doesn't like is quiet. And he goes from the plains of India, the rivers of India, the Ganges, and all the way into the Himalayas, where he meets different people there. And the most prominent characters, I think, the most fully formed characters, are the women of India. And that, again, is something really enjoyable to see. Kipling clearly loved the people of India. Just to say, excuse the lighting change. I had to just take a brief hiatus and adjust the lights because the sun's going down so quickly this time of year. Anyway, the last book I'd like to share with you in my reading wrap-up for Victober is by the great English author Anthony Trollope, and it's the first of his Barsetshire Chronicles books, and that is The Warden, this one actually being the Everyman edition. Everyman books are lovely. They're hardback, cloth bound, and the print inside, I don't know if you can see it. See if that works. It's a good size font with nice spacing, so it makes it enjoyable to read. Now, The Warden is such a gently humorous book. It's a soft satire on the day. And there's a couple of Easter eggs in it, you know, those hidden nuggets for your enjoyment. One of the things about The Warden is that I have to mention is the narrator themselves is such a genial, happy person. Although he knows that some of the characters has foibles, the narrator doesn't come down on them, you know, with bloody thunder kind of attacks for those who are the baddies and over sympathetic to the goodies. No, he tends to look at the positive in everybody, but you can sense who the heroes and the villains are. There's only one thing that comes under harsh criticism in this book, and I'll mention it in a moment, but the story. So the story of The Warden basically you have Barchester Cathedral. So it's a made-up place, Barchester, but it's a typical cathedral city. And nearby there is an almshouse, so a house for the poor. And it was set up in the Middle Ages by a man called John Hiram, who was a merchant. He kept sheep, so he was a wool merchant. And with his money, on his deathbed, his will basically said, I'm going to make this almshouse, and it's to look after 12 different old men in the village at any time who will be taken care of in their dotage and given X amount of money per week. And then the warden of the almshouse, he will be paid a certain amount. Well, of course, that's all well and good. But the warden, who belongs to the church, one Mr. Harding, who is this lovely, timid fellow who does no wrong and wants to do the best by everybody. And he has this very funny foible because he plays the violoncello. Whenever he's nervous, he sort of plays the cello to himself, even though he's not holding it. In one instance, it talks about him playing a sorrowful strain beneath his chair. So his hand's doing this underneath the chair as he's getting perturbed by a particular conversation. Now, the problem is with this will and this almshouse, inflation in money. The land has started to accumulate more wealth, and yet the amount of money given to the 12 old men has stayed the same. Harding, the warden, has 2 daughters. One of them is married to the archdeacon, who is a very sort of strident, demanding kind of fellow, and puts his foot down and is all the authority of the church, whereas Mr. Harding is a bit softer. Harding has another daughter, and she likes this fellow called Bold. That's John Bold is his full name. And he's not anti-clerical, but he thinks that the church has overextended its power. This common theme that you have in a lot of the literature of the 19th century. And John Bold is asked to investigate the will of John Hiram from the Middle Ages about this almshouse and whether the men in there should be getting more money and whether it's ethical for the warden, Mr. Harding, to be getting as much money as he's getting as a living from this place. And from this very innocuous setup, you get an absolute delight of a story and beautiful characterization. Even the archdeacon, which is the son-in-law of Mr. Harding, although he's supposed to be the baddie, he's softened because you get a scene with him in bed with his wife where she's telling him off. You know, where in public the archdeacon is all powerful, here you see his wife just keeping him in check behind the curtains of the 4-poster bed. But the news about the almshouse and how the money is being acquired by the church and given to the warden as opposed to the old men gets taken to a newspaper called the Jupiter. Now, the Jupiter is scathingly attacked by Trollope in this. It's the only element in the book where the narrator is quite caustic. And the Jupiter symbolises none other than the Times, the newspaper, the Times, and how the power of the press, although it's supposed to have freedom, the press is far too mighty. And there are articles released about the warden, Mr. Harding, and how he's this terrible Machiavel who squashes the elderly who are under his care and acquires all of the money to himself, giving them a mere pittance to live on. Well, of course, this is not true because you see Mr. Harding, you see the warden himself, and that he's a lovely guy with terrible pangs of conscience, worried that, am I really taking too much money? I wouldn't want to rob people. But the Jupiter, the newspaper, doesn't care about all of that. It knows how to get public opinion. And this is so relevant for today, isn't it? With all the complaining about the power of the media and whether they really tell the truth or they have their own agenda. So there's nothing new under the sun. And we follow the story of how the archdeacon tries to defend the claims of the warden, how John Bold who loves the warden's younger daughter, how he is trying to get justice done. That's all he's interested in. Even though he knows this could damage his affair of love with the daughter of the warden, he thinks it's right. I have to do this. It's just finding out what's right. So there's these two great powerhouses of characters, and the warden's trapped in the middle, being squished. And you just see his little endeavours to sort things out for himself. The whole story is just an enjoyable, light-hearted romp through a quaint church town of the 19th century. But Trollope is not just a storyteller. He thoroughly believed that stories should educate. And the one little thing that he does in this book is he tries to wake his readers up to the fact that what you read in the news isn't always true. And that those at the top are not always ogres and always in the wrong. But there's a politics, a game being played on both sides. And often it's the innocent who have genuinely good consciences who are maligned and slandered through the newspapers. So it's just really good. Now, there is a little Easter egg in there about Charles Dickens, and if you want to know what that is, go to my Instagram account and just have a flick through some of the videos that I've left on there, and you'll see one about the warden. Anyway, those are 4 of the books that I read through Victober. That was Jane Eyre, North and South, Kim, and The Warden, finally by Anthony Trollope. I don't know what you read, but leave it down in the comments below what you've been reading through Victober and how you got on with them, and any recommendations for anyone else that's reading below. Until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.